Namaste and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna class. Om Sarva Jiva Papanashakaranam Bhaveshwaram Swikritang cha garbhavasa deha pashamidrisham Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami Deva Deva Ramakrishnam Ishwaram Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha Om Tava Katamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadattatam Bhuvi grinanti ye bhurida jana. So this morning, we will continue where we left off last time. We're right at the end of, let's see, what the date was in June 1883, June 10th, 1883, and that was a Sunday. As we're right at the end of that day, and then we will begin June 15th. So in this book, it's on the middle of page 245. So Sri Ramakrishna is in the midst of conversation, talking to the devotees who were there. And again, this being a Sunday, there were a number of devotees who had gathered there. Trailanga Swami once said that because a man reasons, he is conscious of multiplicity, of variety. Attaining samadhi, one gives up the body in 21 days. Spiritual consciousness is not possible without the awakening of the Kundalini. So first he mentions Trailanga Swami. Trailanga Swami was a great Paramahamsa, man of highest realization, who lived in Varanasi for many years. In fact, he's reputed to have lived, I forget whether it's over 200 or over 300 years. 280 something years, something like that. Sri Ramakrishna met him. And even now, there's the temple where he lived, and there's this huge Shiva Lingam, a huge stone, that it said that he found it in the middle of the Ganges, and he carried it and installed it there. It's a stone bigger than an ordinary man could possibly even pick up. And yet, Trailanga Swami, being a Paramahamsa, he sometimes manifested spontaneously, never for show, but just spontaneously extraordinary powers. He would lie naked on the hot sands of Benares in the summer, and he would lie naked in the cold of winter in Varanasi, unaffected by the elements, an extraordinary man. So Sri Ramakrishna from time to time would refer to Trailanga Swami because of his greatness. So here he says that an interesting statement that because a man reasons, he is conscious of multiplicity, of variety. So that because he reasons. Now, those of you who have studied Swami Vivekananda, you know that he gave great importance to reason and was extremely rational in his exposition of Vedanta. But Swami Vivekananda also insisted over and over that religion is beyond reason. But he would say it's not contrary to reason, it's beyond the reach of reason. That's an extremely important distinction. And I bring it up here because what Sri Ramakrishna says is true, but people tend to misinterpret that. And think that anything that is irrational might just be religious. But no, religious truth doesn't contradict reason, but it's determined beyond the reach of reason. For instance, one can present a number of arguments to show that the Advaita philosophy of non-dualism, that there's one non-dual reality and that this universe is just an appearance of that. There are many very reasonable arguments to support that argument, or that idea, but you cannot prove it by reason. It's not subject to rational proof. You can give reasonable evidence explaining why it would be rational for one to believe such a thing, but you can't possibly prove it because it's beyond the reach of reason. And so in that way, the spiritual truth doesn't contradict reason, but reason can't establish it. And so here, of course, Sri Ramakrishna is not talking about establishing religious truth or anything like that. He's saying that the rational mind is that which creates variety. That itself is a strange statement until one thinks about it. The mind is by nature dualistic. And what is reason? What is logic? Logic is just formalizing the processes of the common sense mind. Logic doesn't transcend reason, it's formalizing the way that the mind thinks. And the mind thinks through language, which means it thinks through concepts which are linguistically based. And the mind thinks in terms of opposites and pairs of opposites and categorizing things. In fact, all of learning, as Swami Vivekananda says in one place, all of learning is really just nothing but categorizing and showing relationships between categories. That's all that learning is. I was shocked as a mid-teen when I started studying biology, not as part of the broader science class as in middle school or elementary school, but when I started taking the subject biology and found that biology was, as we began to study it, much of it was just classification of species and genus and phylum and family, etc. I had begun to study physics and chemistry, which I liked much more than when I got to biology and found that, at least in the beginning, of course, biology goes much further than just analyzing into species, etc. But the way it was introduced to me was that. But that is really what learning is, what knowledge is. When we learn a language, when we learn a science, when we learn a field of mathematics, when we learn geography, it's classification and showing relationships between classifications. That's all that learning is. And so reason is formalized common sense. And the mind deals in polarities and in categories. There's right and there's left. There's up and there's down. There's heat and there's cold. There's pleasure and there's pain. There's the finite and the infinite coming to, there's freedom and slavery coming to abstractions, love and hatred, etc. And so the mind deals in these polar opposites in dualism, I and thou, I and it, the world as an it, or the world as a thou, or a person as a thou, and a non-person as an it. And so subject and object, knower and known, etc. So when we understand that, then we see that what Trailanga Swami said from his own experience, and what Sri Ramakrishna was repeating from his own experience, that reason is that which creates multiplicity. So that doesn't mean that by being irrational, that you go beyond multiplicity. No, if you become irrational, you just go mad. So irrationality is not what we want. We want to go beyond rationality because that is where truth lies. And then he goes on to say, actually, this paragraph is made up of completely separate, three sentences, each one of which is a different subject. And so then he says, attaining samadhi, one gives up the body in 21 days. And so that was a frequent statement of Sri Ramakrishna's that I haven't found elsewhere. And what he meant was when one attains to nirvikalpa samadhi, because I have known swamis who have attained to other samadhis, high samadhis, but not the nirvikalpa samadhi. So Sri Ramakrishna used to say that only those return from the highest nirvikalpa samadhi who have been given a work by the Divine Mother. The Mother brings them back from nirvikalpa samadhi for a purpose of hers. That is, some sort of teaching purpose, usually, exemplifying and teaching, like Ramana Maharshi. But Sri Ramakrishna would often say this, that otherwise, when one enters nirvikalpa samadhi, the mind dissolves, the ego dissolves, and only Brahman remains. One isn't conscious of any duality, nor of individuality. One knows oneself to be the infinite, but not even as oneself. There's not even the thought, I am the infinite. What it is can't be expressed. There are experiences on the verge of that, where yes, one has the knowledge, I am the infinite. But that experience itself is beyond all conceptualization, all words, all expression. And so one enters that, and then what is to bring one back? Now, traditionally in Advaita Vedanta, they say that one's prarabdha brings one back. But Sri Ramakrishna said that no, it's only the will of the Divine Mother that can bring one back if they are fully identified with Brahman. And so Swami Sarvagatanandaji, whom some of you knew, a great Swami who was head of our centers in Boston and Providence for decades, he said that when he was in Kankal for many years before coming to America, where he joined and where he stayed for many years, all of the years of his training, that there was a monk who brought his teacher one day to the hospital in Kankal. In those days, the hospital, our hospital in Kankal, which is right next to Haridwar, was a hospital mainly for sadhus. Nowadays, Haridwar is a big city, and so the hospital is for everyone. But in those days, it was mainly sadhus who lived in Haridwar and Rishikesh. And Swami Vivekananda had told one of his disciples, Swami Kalyanananda, that look, the sadhus in that area have no one to care for them when they're sick. And so he sent Swami Kalyanananda to begin to care for sick sadhus. And that developed into a hospital. And again, in the early years, it was mainly populated by sadhus. So back to the story of Swami Sarvagatanandaji. One day, a monk brought his revered teacher, a Swami, to the hospital and told the staff that my teacher went into a deep state and now he isn't returning. He doesn't come back. And there's no sign of life, and yet his body is still warm. And we can't revive him. And so the doctors examined him, and Swami Sarvagatananda and other sadhus realized that this man, because he was a highly regarded holy man, not just ordinary run-of-the-mill sadhu, but a highly revered holy man, that he was in a high state of samadhi. So Swami Sarvagatanandaji thought he had always wondered about Sri Ramakrishna's statement about 21 days in samadhi. So he found out when this man had entered into that state before they brought him to the hospital. And sure enough, on the 21st day, the sadhu passed away without ever coming back to external consciousness. And so that was one supporting evidence for Sri Ramakrishna's statement, a very interesting evidence that one of our swamis that many of us knew well himself witnessed. So, and then the last sentence, spiritual consciousness is not possible without the awakening of the Kundalini. So the Kundalini is the mechanism with regard to the physical body and the psychic body, the subtle body, the physical body and the subtle body. The spiritual mechanism of spiritual awakening. Many people, perhaps most people, have spiritual awakening all the way to enlightenment without having had a Kundalini experience. But those who accept the idea, the modality, or the model of the Kundalini, like Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother, Swami Vivekananda, say that all spiritual experience comes through the awakening of the Kundalini. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the experience will be a Kundalini-like experience with the movement in the pulsation in the spine and the awakening of the different chakras with the final one here. No, it may just be the fruit of the experience. So the analogy is given, the very good analogy of electricity. We can turn on a light and get the use of light without knowing about the wiring and the breakers and the transformers and the dynamo that produces the electricity, etc., the distribution system, all of that. All we want to do is use electricity, we flip a switch and we've got it without understanding the wiring. And so Kundalini is like the wiring of spiritual experience within a psychophysical system of a living being. And so when spiritual experience is seen in regards to processes in the physical and psychic body, subtle body, then that is reflected as and seen as the operation of Kundalini. So spiritual consciousness is not possible without the awakening of the Kundalini. Yes, one can have the awakening of spiritual consciousness without being aware of the Kundalini system, but it's that which has given the awakening of spiritual consciousness. For instance, in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the great science of the mind, produced in very ancient times, long before the time of Christ, by the great sage Patanjali, there's no mention whatsoever of Kundalini. Kundalini came into literature centuries later, though Swami Vivekananda said that he believed a passage in the Vedas was actually a reference to the Kundalini, given in symbolic form. And then you look at the spiritual experiences of saints in other traditions. In the Buddhist tradition and the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, they have the same idea of Kundalini, but they leave out a couple of the chakras. But they have the same idea of chakras. I think they have 5 instead of the 7, including the Sahasrara. But they have the idea of the Kundalini. And but most Buddhists don't speak of Kundalini. The Buddha himself didn't speak of Kundalini. And so again, one can have the experience of enlightenment without having it come as a Kundalini experience, but that is the basis of it. In Christianity, you find the great Christian saints, you don't find mention of Kundalini except in very rare places, like in Jacob Böhme, the great German Protestant mystic. There haven't been many Protestant mystics. There have been a few, but a very few compared to the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, which produced a huge number of saints. But in the Protestant tradition, there were very few, but one of them, Jacob Böhme, who lived less than a century after Martin Luther, so one of the early Lutherans, he talks about the 7 heavens within the body, which are just like the 7 awakening of the 7 planes of consciousness as the Kundalini rises through the Sushumna. And so it's a clear reference to an experience of the Kundalini that he had. And so once in a while in a mystic, you will find such mentions. But again, in many mystics, you'll never find any mention of a Kundalini-like experience, and that's why. So Sri Ramakrishna continues, a man who has realized God shows certain characteristics. he becomes like a child or a madman or an inert thing or a ghoul. Further, he is firmly convinced that he is the machine and God is the operator, that God alone is the doer and all others are his instruments. As some Sikh devotees once said to me, even the leaf moves at the will of God. One should be aware that everything happens by the will of Rama. The weaver said, the price of the cloth by the will of Rama is 1 rupee 6 annas. By the will of Rama, the robbery was committed. By the will of Rama, the robbers were arrested. By the will of Rama, I too was arrested by the police. And at last, by the will of Rama, I was released. So here, first he says that a man who has realized God shows certain characteristics, that he becomes like a child or a madman or an inert thing or a ghoul. This is mentioned by Sri Shankaracharya in the Viveka Chudamani. He says that to those who have realized the highest, their character manifests or the character of their illumination manifests within them in different ways. Sometimes the person becomes like a child, so utterly simple, completely guileless, completely transparent, completely carefree. I've seen such people like Ram Moy Maharaj, Swami Gaurishwaranandaji, a disciple of Holy Mother. When I first met him, I knew he was a disciple of Holy Mother, but my first thought on the first day I met him was that he's so simple, I don't see anything to him. People say, disciple of Holy Mother. Well, yes, that's true, and that's a great thing, no doubt. But I don't see anything special to him. I don't feel around him what I feel around Gopesh Maharaj or President Maharaj or Nirvananandji, these other great souls. He's so simple, he's just like a child. But later, as I associated with him more, I saw that no, that was the sign of his spirituality. He was completely carefree, like a child. He held important posts and everything. He had to suffer in different situations. He had difficult responsibilities at times. And yet, in the midst of everything, he was always like a carefree child. That idea that mother is there, what do I have to worry about? She'll take care of everything. And so I soon understood that it was that very utter simplicity and guilelessness which was the sign of his spirituality. And then he says that there are others who become like a madman, and that, of course, those who have read the life of Sri Ramakrishna remember the story of the madman who showed up at Dakshineshwar, who was actually a Paramahamsa, a man of the highest realization. But his outward appearance and behavior was that of a madman. Dirty, unkempt, naked, eating with the dogs, feeding them and feeding himself, no sense of cleanliness, etc. But Sri Ramakrishna said, no, he's a man of the highest realization in whom all distinctions of pure and impure, good and bad, all of that has disappeared. And then an inert thing. Yes, some become inert, like Ramana Maharshi for a long time was in a state like that. Later, he began to talk to people, but after his realization at the age of 16, for a number of years, he just sat like an inert thing, not talking to anyone, not expressing anything, just or staring off into space. Of course, he wasn't actually staring off into space. He was absorbed in a high state. Or then as a ghoul. And that, of course, is another variation on the madman theme. And there have been others like that. In fact, in Russia, there was a tradition in the Russian Orthodox Church before the Russian Revolution. There was a tradition of fools for Christ. That is, it was thought that there was a class of saints, and there were stories about many of them, records of many of them. Some of them undoubtedly were just madmen, but some of them were great saints who appeared like madmen, and they were called fools for Christ, who had no regard for society or propriety or anything like that. Not that they did immoral things, no. But they acted as madmen. And and then he says that a man who has realized God shows certain characteristics, and then he says that they manifest in these ways. And then he goes on. Further, he is convinced that he is the machine and God is the operator. That's a surprising thing in the life of Ramana Maharshi. Again, I bring him up often because he's a good example of one who was a pure jnani, a follower of the path of knowledge. But if you read his life and his teachings both, you'll find how often he said everything happens according to the will of God. Over and over again. He wrote a beautiful letter to his mother after he had run away from home and was living in Tiruvannamalai. He wrote a beautiful letter to his mother to tell her that he was okay and that she shouldn't worry about him. And in that, he gives a beautiful passage on how everything happens according to the will of God. And we can't change one thing by our own will, that everything is done by the will of God. So Sri Ramakrishna says that one who has attained to illumination has that awareness that everything happens by the will of God. And God alone is the doer and all others are his instruments. As that beautiful famous song of the Bengali poet Saint Ram Prasad says, Sokoli tomari icha. Everything is your will, O Mother. Icha moi mat tara tumi. You are the savior. You the savioress. You the one who saves. You are Ichamoy, the willful one. People say I do, Koriyami, but you are the one who does everything. And so this is the idea of that song. Tumi jantri ami jantro. You are the operator. I am the machine. So God is its operator, and God alone is the doer, and all others are his instruments. Then he says, some Sikh devotees once said to me, even the leaf moves because of God's will. So Sri Ramakrishna was very popular among the Sikhs in the area. They would often come to him as a group to hear him speak. And sometimes when they were leaving after being gathered with him, talking to him, listening to him, then they would see some of the Hindu devotees, they would say, he's one of us. With that pride that, yes, he's one of us. And so Sri Ramakrishna always spoke very highly of the Sikhs. He had great regard for their devotion and their traditions. And so that the Sikh devotees said that even the leaf moves in the wind by the will of God. He says one should be aware that everything happens by the will of Rama. And then he refers to a story that most of you will be familiar with, the story of the weaver who was caught by a band of robbers and made to carry their stolen goods. And so when he was brought before the judge asked him to explain himself. And so then he said that everything happened by the will of Rama, that the robbers came by the will of Rama, they grabbed me by the will of Rama, they gave me these things to carry by the will of Rama, the police came by the will of Rama, they arrested me by the will of Rama, and now by the will of Rama I am standing here before the judge. And the judge must have been a man with some spiritual sensitivity, because he saw, he was impressed by the complete transparency of the man speaking and knew that he wasn't just making up excuses. And so he let him go. So that story is used to illustrate to the fact that a person of high spirituality sees everything as the will of Rama. That is, everything as the will of God. So then the last paragraph of the day, it was dusk. Sri Ramakrishna had had no rest since his midday meal. He talked unceasingly to the devotees about God. At last, the visitors took their leave and went home. And so it's little paragraphs like this that bring reality to the scene. As we're reading through, hearing stories and hearing the words of Sri Ramakrishna, very beautiful instructions and stories and so forth, but it's little passages like this that tie it to a place and time so that we can imagine it, so that we can picture it, so that we can do lila dhyana, a meditation based on the activities of a great soul, of an incarnation of God. We can picture the dusk and the devotees, Sri Ramakrishna ending the conversation and the devotees walking away, and Sri Ramakrishna being left in silence as his mind once again goes into a high state, which was its normal dwelling place. He brought it down forcibly in order to talk with and deal with others out of compassion for all. And also, where it says Sri Ramakrishna had had no rest since his midday meal, talking continually to the devotees. Uh, so Swami Vivekananda says in his one of his Sanskrit hymns to Sri Ramakrishna, he has the line "Karma kalevaram adbhuta cheshtam." He who was a master of work, that is of karma yoga. This comes after a line about him being the ideal bhakta and the ideal jnani both. And then he says, but also a master of activity whose efforts were extraordinary. So his efforts in the field of spiritual practice, but also his efforts in the field of spiritual ministration were extraordinary. Even when he had cancer of the throat and couldn't swallow food, extremely painful all of the time. This was before the days of modern pain remediation and anesthesia, etc. So extraordinary pain, and yet even then he would insist on speaking to visitors and telling them about God. So now we come to Friday, June 15th, 1883. It was a holiday on account of the Hindu religious festival Dasara. Among the devotees who visited Sri Ramakrishna at Dakshineshwar that day were Adhar, M, and Rakhal's father. Rakhal's father-in-law was also present. All were seated on the floor of the master's room. So again, it being a holiday, the number of people had come. And so he mentions these who were there, but it wasn't exclusively just these people. Those are the ones that M mentions. And important among them for the immediate reading was Rakhal's father, that is the future Swami Brahmananda's father, and his paternal grandfather. Or no, not his paternal grandfather, his maternal grandfather, that is the father of Rakhal's father's wife, or Rakhal's father's father-in-law, or Rakhal's father's. Oh yeah, yes, right, yes, right. So it's in English we don't have good ways of specifying detailed relationships as they do in India, and some other countries. Many Western countries, like in French, English, Spanish, there are not so many relationships named. Swedish has more. Like murmur means mother's mother, and murfar means mother's father. Farfar means father's father, and farmur means father's mother. But in English, we don't have that. So Rakhal's father's father-in-law. So that is Rakhal's father's wife. Huh? No, Rakhal's father's father. Oh, father-in-law. Oh, yes, that could be. Yes, yeah, that must be what it is. Yes. I was thinking, yes, yeah, you're right. It has to be. Rakhal's father's wife, his father-in-law, or her father. Right. Okay. Yes, I don't know why that was so confusing. In fact, I had it figured out on first reading before the class, and then when I saw father's father-in-law, I got all confused. So sorry about that. So that was Rakhal's mother's father. Master with a smile. Why not? Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the statement. Rakhal's father's father-in-law was a devotee of God. He asked the master, "Sir, can one realize God while leading the life of a householder?" So this is a question that comes up again and again in the gospel, and Sri Ramakrishna gives a variety of answers. And so that helpful, and that's why these repetitions are helpful, because the answer is not the same. Here he says with a smile, why not? That is, why not? Why would it not be possible to realize God living as a householder? Why not? Live in the world like a mudfish. The mudfish lives in the mud, but itself remains unstained. Or live in the world like a loose woman. She attends to her household duties, but her mind is always on her sweetheart. Do your duties in the world, fixing your mind on God. But this is extremely difficult. I said to the members of the Brahmo Samaj, suppose a typhoid patient is kept in a room where there are jars of pickles and pitchers of water. How can you expect the patient to recover? The very thought of spiced pickles brings water to one's mouth. To a man, woman is like that pickle. The craving for worldly things, which is chronic in man, is like the patient's craving for water. There is no end to this craving. The typhoid patient says, I shall drink a whole pitcher of water. The situation is very difficult. There is so much confusion in the world. If you go this way, you are threatened with a shovel. If you go that way, you are threatened with a broomstick. Again, in another direction, you are threatened with a shoe beating. Besides, one cannot think of God unless one lives in solitude. The goldsmith melts gold to make ornaments, but how can he do his work well if he is disturbed again and again? Suppose you are separating rice from bits of husk. You must do it all by yourself. Every now and then you have to take the rice in your hand to see how clean it is. But how can you do your work well if you are called away again and again? So it's a long paragraph, but a very important and beautiful paragraph. So here, first of all, he says that why should it not be possible? Live in the world like the mudfish. So the mudfish is a fish found in parts of India, like in Bengal and Bangladesh, which has very extraordinarily slippery skin. It's like it looks like it has like a film of gelatin covering its body. But mud doesn't stick to it. So it lives in the mud, it burrows in the mud, it can even come out of the water for limited periods of time and go back into the water. And so it lives in the mud, but you take it out of the mud and the mud just falls off. It doesn't cake around it as it does around normal things. So live in the world like the mudfish. That is, live in the world with all of the objects of desire, objects of temptation, the activities, the problems, and all of that. But be like the mudfish, that is, be untouched by the things of the world. And so a more common illustration given in India is of the lotus leaf, which grows out of the mud, but even water doesn't cling to it. You pour water onto the lotus leaf, it beads up and rolls right off. But the mudfish is an even more apt illustration because it actually lives in the mud. And or then he says, or live in the world like a loose woman. She does all of her duties in her household. He's speaking, of course, of a married woman, but one who has a lover outside of the family. And so she does all of her household duties, but her mind is always thinking of her lover and when she can meet him again. And so like that, live in the world, doing the things that you have to do, but with your mind knowing that what I really want is that, is God, is the realization, is the self. So live in the world with your mind like that, preoccupied with that. So we have to do our duties in the world. We have to take care of things in order to lead, in order to live. As Sri Krishna says in the third chapter, Sharira yatra pichate na prasidhyera karmanaha. You can't even survive in the body without work. You have to do work, even to survive in a physical body. And so we have to do that. But do that with the mind fixed, however, on the idea that my real goal is not here among these things. This is not what I'm living for. This is what I have to take care of just to live. But what I want is that which is the real thing behind all of this, not somewhere else in space, geographically somewhere else. No, right here, but behind all of this, which all of this is distracting me from. So what I want is that the essence, the reality, that which is the divine being, God, the divine mother. Live like that. Do your duties in the world, fixing your mind on God. But then he says, but it is extremely difficult. So yes, he realizes that what he's telling people is not, live like a mudfish. And so everyone's going to go home and start living like a mudfish. It's not so easy. This is a lifetime's work. This is extremely difficult. I said to the members of the Brahmo Samaj, then he gives the example he often gives of the typhoid patient. Now, in my lifetime, typhoid has not been a problem in America. It was at one time, and it's still a problem in some countries. Sometimes there's still typhoid cases in India. But because I have never seen typhoid or had to deal with it, I was inoculated as a kid, as most kids here were. I'm not familiar with the treatment or even the symptoms. If I had typhoid, I wouldn't even know that I had it. I'd have to have a doctor tell me I had it. But apparently, typhoid makes one extremely thirsty. And at least at this time, in Sri Ramakrishna's time, it was thought that the typhoid patient gets tremendously thirsty, but the water is bad for them. And so they have to be kept from drinking too much water. So that much we can assume from the story that Sri Ramakrishna would often tell. And so whether that's still considered the proper treatment for a typhoid, or part of the treatment for a typhoid patient, or whether it was just a belief at that time, I don't know. But it doesn't matter, because Sri Ramakrishna is not giving medical advice. He's giving an analogy to explain something else. So the scientific validity of the example doesn't matter. It may be, may not be. So he would often tell, as he tells here, of the typhoid patient, if you keep the typhoid patient in a room where you have pickles, that is achar. He's not talking about dill pickles that we think of with the word pickle in the West. He's speaking about Indian pickles, achar, highly spiced bits of lemon or green mango or chili or other things can be pickled. All sorts of things can be pickled. Ginger can be pickled, many different things. But one who has a taste for pickle, which means most people from India, you grow up eating pickle, and some of us who have lived in India or even never went to India but developed a taste for the pickles, then to think of the pickles or to see the pickles, your mouth starts watering. And so he says that to leave jars of pickles and pitchers of water in the room of a typhoid patient is only asking for trouble. Because even if they don't taste the pickle, if they taste it, even worse. But even if they don't taste it, just seeing the pickle, they'll start getting thirsty, and then they'll want to drink water. So he says that the analogy means that if you live in the midst of sense objects which are tempting, then it's very hard to give them up. If you are not in a room of, say, the typhoid patient, if the patient is taken to a room where there are no pickles, and for an American, no barbecued potato chips or something like that, that make you thirsty, then you can handle the disease better. But if you're in the midst of things which are going to constantly call to you, entice you, seduce you into tasting them, then it's very difficult to get cured. The very thought of spiced pickles brings water to one's mouth. So he said, to a man, woman is like that pickle. The craving for worldly things, which is chronic in man, is like the patient's craving for water. There is no end to this craving. The typhoid patient says, I shall drink a whole pitcher of water. Again, because it must be associated with a craving for water. And the situation is very difficult. That is, it's very difficult for the typhoid patient, and it's very difficult for us if we're living in the midst of temptation. So he says that there's so much, goes on to say that there's so much confusion in the world. If you go this way, you get a beating. If you go that way, you get some other kind of beating. If you go this way, then you get a shoe beating. And that also for non-Indian readers or listeners. Shoe beating, we never think of a shoe beating in America. Nobody ever threatens to give a shoe beating. But that in the East, all the way from the Middle East through India. I don't know about China, but at least from the Middle East through India, shoe beating is not just a beating, but it's a terrible humiliation. So you remember during the Gulf War, the second Gulf War, when George Bush had gone to Iraq after the invasion, and the things were, then somebody, a reporter I think it was, threw a shoe at him. Now that, you think, well, he threw something at him and he took his shoe and threw it. No, that wasn't just throwing something. That was throwing the most insulting thing that you could. Throwing a shoe at him was not just trying to hit him with something. You pick up the first thing you can find. No, that's intentionally the gravest humiliation and insult, to throw a shoe at him. And so, again, that's why Sri Ramakrishna says you are threatened with again, in another direction, you're threatened with a shoe beating. So he's talking about living in the world. From all sides, you're getting beatings. You're getting threats from all sides. As I've said many times, life is problem solving. That's not the purpose of life, but that's the process of life. The process of life is constant problem solving. It never ends. And yet we think we have big problems and little problems. The little problems we don't think about much. We just do them, take care of them, get through them. And then we have big problems. And so the big problems, we think, well, as soon as I can get finished with this, then life is going to be smooth. Let me just get this over with. I can't wait to get this over with so I can relax again. And while we're solving that big problem, two other big problems are coming around the corner towards us. And that's the way life goes on from childhood, from infancy, from birth to death. So life as a process is nothing but problem solving. And so we're getting beaten from all sides. And then he says, besides, one cannot think of God unless one lives in solitude. So here he's first talking about living in the world, and yes, one can realize God living in the world. And certainly in other occasions, he gave examples of people living in the world who had realized God. So yes, it is possible. But here he's reminding them that don't think, therefore, that it's easy. It's extremely difficult. And so he says here, one cannot think of God unless one lives in solitude. And so he doesn't say it here. So I'll fill in something that many of you know that he says in many other places where this topic comes up. He says that for householders, it's very beneficial to go into solitude from time to time. For a day, for a weekend, for a week, for a month, for 6 months, as one is capable of doing. But by going into solitude and thinking about God, one strengthens one's ability to meditate on God. And then when one comes back to one's normal circumstances, one has strengthened that habit and that ability. The goldsmith, he goes on, melts gold to make ornaments. But how can he do his work well if he is disturbed again and again? So to do anything like the work of a goldsmith, which is much finer work than, say, a blacksmith who handles big pieces of iron. But the goldsmith, because of the preciousness of gold, you can't waste a drop. With the ironsmith, the blacksmith, lots of iron can be wasted without much thought about it. But with gold, no, you protect every drop. So it has to be very careful. And then in gold, they're not making plowshares and things like that, big heavy objects or hammers or anything like that. They're making fine jewelry, refined shapes of jewelry. So the work is very delicate work. So the goldsmith melts gold to make ornaments, but how can he do his work well if he is disturbed again and again? That is, he needs quiet and undisturbed time in which to focus on what he's doing. Suppose you are separating rice from bits of a husk. So in India, of course, you see that. Here, you go to the market and buy rice that's already prepared. You don't even have to sort stones out of it. But in India, you have to sort out stones, and it used to be more common, and you still see it in some places where you had to sort out the husks. And of course, in the village side, they still do that. You must do it all by yourself. That is, to get it out, you can't. You have to pay attention to what you're doing. Every now and then, you have to take the rice in your hand to see how clean it is. But how can you do your work well if you are called away again and again? So you're trying to do this, and then you're called away to pay attention to something else, and you come back and you forget where you were. What is the rice that I was working on? What is the rice that's clean, etc. So then a devotee asks, "What then is the way, sir?" Master, there is a way. One succeeds if one develops a strong spirit of renunciation. And here he's speaking about householders. Give up at once with determination what you know to be unreal. Once, when I was seriously ill, I was taken to the physician Ganga Prasad Sen. He was a famous physician in Calcutta at the time. He said to me, "I shall give you a medicine, but you mustn't drink any water. You may take pomegranate juice." Everyone wondered how I could live without water, but I was determined not to drink it. I said to myself, I am a Paramahamsa, not a goose. I shall drink only milk. So, starting at the top of the paragraph, one needs to develop a strong spirit of renunciation. That is, I want God. Let other things go to the side. Yes, I'll take care of that which I have to take care of. I'll do my duties, but this is what I want. Give up at once with determination what you know to be unreal. And then he talks about going to Ganga Prasad Sen, who told him that he could not drink any water for some days. He could only take the juice of pomegranate seeds. And so in other places we know, from other places we know, other sources, that Sri Ramakrishna told those, which probably meant Holy Mother and maybe someone else like Hriday, his nephew, that when preparing him the pomegranate juice, of course, you take the seeds out of the shell, and then you wash it to get rid of all of the white stuff that is in part of the shell that goes through the seeds. So you wash it to get rid of that. So he told him, dry the pomegranate seeds before making the juice. So the doctor had said, don't drink any water. So he was so determined not to drink any water that they had to dry off the seeds of the pomegranate, or the pomegranate seeds, before making it into juice. And so then he says that when people wondered how he could do it, he said, well, I'm a Paramahamsa, not a goose. So Hamsa means a goose, and a Paramahamsa means the supreme goose, which refers to a Rajahamsa, that is a Rajahamsa means a swan. Hamsa, goose, ordinary goose, Rajhamsa, swan, and a Paramahamsa is a realized soul. And it's said that the swan in folklore in India, that the swan is able to separate the milk from water. In a mixture of milk and water, it separates the milk from the water. So I am a Paramahamsa, I shall drink only milk, meaning that if he tells me not to drink any water, then yes, I will not do that. I will only take the pomegranate juice. And so again, he had the seeds dried. And he said also about this time elsewhere that when he would rinse his mouth out, which a Hindu does after eating anything, even drinking tea, though, if there's a place to do it, they go to rinse their mouth out. So when he'd rinse his mouth out, he said his throat would constrict of itself, so that not even a drop of water from rinsing his mouth out could go down his throat, because he had taken that determination. So in his case, his body obeyed his mind so completely that that happened. And one last paragraph I'll read and then close. You have to spend a few days in solitude. If you but touch the granny, you are safe. Turn yourself into gold and then live wherever you please. After realizing God and divine love in solitude, one may live in the world as well. To Rakal's father, he said, "That is why I ask the youngsters to stay with me, for they will develop love of God by staying here a few days. After that, they can very well lead the life of a householder." So again, he recommended people to go into solitude from time to time in order to strengthen their mind. And he gives the example of the children's game in India that if you but touch the granny, then you are safe. If you touch the granny, then nobody can tag you. And so turn yourself into gold and then live wherever you please. Once you are gold, then there's no tarnishing. If you're brass, if you're copper, yes, there's tarnishing. If you're iron, there's rusting. But if you're gold, there's no tarnishing, no rusting. So after realizing God and divine love in solitude, one may live in the world as well. And so then he turns to Rakhal's father and says, "That's why I ask these youngsters to stay here with me sometimes, and then they can lead a householder's life." And so he's telling Rakhal's father because he knows that Rakhal's father has not been pleased that Rakhal is spending time with him. And so to assuage his concern, he says, "This is why I tell the youngsters to stay here sometime." And then says that if they do that, then if they wish, they can lead a householder life later. Of course, Sri Ramakrishna already knew that Rakhal was not destined for that, though he was married. But he renounced the world. So we'll stop here and continue next time here. And let me give announcements, and if there's any question, I'll answer that after the a question. Okay. Okay, so I'll give announcements and then the question. So for announcements, on Sunday, we won't have our usual lecture. We will have a memorial service for Margaret Nosek, Peggy, as we knew her, or Peg, or she had the spiritual name Dhira, a disciple of Swami Sarvagatanandaji, a long-time devotee. Her parents were devotees as well. And she was at one time the president of the society back in the 1980s. And so a long-time devotee. We will have a service for her. She passed away a week ago, and it will be over Zoom, not over YouTube. And so to join that, you will need a Zoom link, which we can send to you. If you don't receive it today and you want to attend the service, you're most welcome to. Let us know, and we will send you a link. But you'll have to have a link to join Zoom. It's not like YouTube where anyone in the world can sign in and watch a live stream. So please let us know if you want to. So now, and then next week we'll continue the usual classes and lectures. So now everything is will of God versus God does not do things to us. Hindu versus Judeo-Christian. So there are a variety of views on this, both within Hinduism and within the Judeo-Christian traditions, the Abrahamic traditions, Regina. Sri Ramakrishna would often say, Ramana Maharshi would say, and many others say that everything happens by God's will. And Sri Ramakrishna would say that when one realizes God, one realizes that God does do everything. However, as Swami Vivekananda said, we at present, everything we do with the sense of free will. And so as Sri Ramakrishna said, God has put the sense of free will into everyone so that we take responsibility for our actions. As long as we have the sense of free will, as long as we have the sense that I could choose to do this or to do that, then there will be karma, and we will have to suffer for our karma. So if I do something bad, I'm going to receive the results from it. The bad results reflected back from the action to me, either now or later in my life, because that is the way karma works. It depends on a sense of free agency. I can do this or I could do that. If I do good, something good will, a good will be reflected back to me. If I do something bad, a bad will be reflected back to me. Though sometimes, of course, again, there's a long delay between the action and the fruit that comes back to us. That's why it can seem like we're doing only good things, but bad things keep happening to us. That's because that's a load from past karma that we are exhausting. But someday that will be exhausted, and the good things that we're doing now will come back to us. And so, as long as we have the sense of free will, we have to take responsibility for our actions. That is, I can't do something bad and say that, no, I'm not going to accept the result because everything happens by God's will. No, the result is going to come to me. I can't avoid it. It's going to chase me and it will catch me. I can't outrun it. And so, as long as there's a sense of agency, which all of us have now, karma works. But a time comes when we see that everything is God's will. Swami Vivekananda gives an explanation, which I'm not going to repeat here because it's very difficult to understand. Even when you read it and meditate over it and read it again and again, it can be understood, but it's very difficult to understand. For which reason it was taken out of the complete work. It was never put in the complete works. I've tried to restore it in the new edition, which will come out, but whether they will leave it, I don't know. It's an extremely important passage of Swamiji that explains how it is that when there is no free will, where everything is already happening according to a determined process, still we have the sense of freedom, and that still works within our closed universe. It's a very difficult concept, and I won't try to explain it here. But what I do want to get across is that, yes, God's will determines everything, even the movement of a leaf, the footfall of an ant, your inhalation and your exhalation, even when you think that you're doing it intentionally. Everything is determined by God. Everything is according to God's will. But in our present life, we don't realize that. And so we can practice surrender, trying to surrender to God, but that's a practice where we still feel that I have a free will. And so in spiritual life, we have to learn how to use the sense of free will and how to try to learn to surrender to God's will. And in the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the three of them have, within each of the three, there are different views. And so taking Christianity, for example, there is the idea of Calvin that everything is predestined. It's a rather crude form of predestination, I must say. It's quite a crude form of predestination. But it's based on the idea that if God knows everything, God already knows who's going to be saved and who's not going to be saved from the beginning of the world, because God knows everything. And so everything is, in that sense, already decided. So nothing you can do will change that. That's a very crude form of predestination. And so that's why in Catholicism and other Protestant traditions, they don't accept it. Though it's based on a crude understanding of the same idea. In Islam, there's an idea of predestination. In Judaism, you have the different ideas as well. So, and within Hinduism, there are texts like the Yoga Vashishta, which talk about the necessity, or that everything happens according to your will. And so usually teaches self-effort. There are other scriptures which say that everything happens by God's will, so practice surrender. So you have on one side in the Hindu tradition, in the Vedanta tradition, those who emphasize self-effort, others who emphasize surrender. And but the ultimate truth is, when one realizes the highest truth, one sees that everything is happening according to some inscrutable will. And that whatever you did, that was just following a pattern, which was that was already there. That what you thought were decisions of yours. And I'll end with this, because otherwise I could give several talks on free will and predestination and so forth. But I'll just end with this to say that if we analyze it logically, or analyze the situation logically, we see how the things that we do that we think are free choices, they're not really free. And that gives support to this teaching of Sri Ramakrishna and many others, that everything happens according to God's will. That is, if you offer me chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream, one day I think, well, yeah, I'd like a chocolate. So I think that that's a free choice. I had an option, and I chose the chocolate because that's what I wanted, and that's why. No, if you could, as even we ordinary people can't, but if you could see all of the things going on within my mind and body, you would see that in that moment, it was obvious that I was going to choose chocolate. Nothing else was going to be chosen. That was a all of the uh, various forces at work, dynamisms at work within my mind and body chemistry and all of that, were directing me to want chocolate. Another day, I choose vanilla and think, well, you see, I chose chocolate last time, I chose vanilla this time, so I'm free. No, if you could see everything going on within me, you would see that there was a reason why I chose vanilla, and that reason means there was a cause. And so my choosing vanilla was not free. So I know that's a difficult concept for anyone. So don't worry if you you don't understand this completely. But what can be understood is that yes, everything eventually we see happens according to God's will. And right now we have a sense of free will, and so we either have to use that to use my sense of free agency to do spiritual practice to try to realize God out of self-effort, or to realize that if it's true that everything happens to God, let me surrender to God and ask God to open the door for spirituality and depend on God. So practice dependence on God, or practice self-effort. I'm going to sit for meditation. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. Whichever way is more natural to you. And that may change over the course of a lifetime. So that's a long answer to a very good question, but I'll leave it there for now. So I'll give a closing chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhrita Vigraham Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidnyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namama.